Good afternoon, everybody. I think ordinarily I would say good afternoon from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, but we are living in a pandemic and multiple levels of lockdown. So good afternoon from my home. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion today. My name is Nao Mokopa, and I work for the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So the Nelson Mandela Foundation is a non-profit organization working in the memory dialogue nexus. We are a custodian of Nelson Mandela's life and times and work to mobilize his legacy by providing memory and dialogue resources towards the creation of an equal society premised on human rights and dignity for all. Kopano Maroja once said that grief has many mouths, some of which we drink from. And as a young person living in this country at this time, there is an abundance of mouths to drink from. When you are my age, apartheid can seem like a phantom train that crashed through the living room and just stayed there. It seems like an inarticulate nightmare, a nightmare of loss, of trauma, and of indiscriminate dehumanization. Today, with EMS Productions, which produced the documentary Murder in Paris, the documentary that recently aired on the life and legacy of Dr. September on SABC3, we are considering the life and legacy of Dulcie September. Dulcie September was a high-ranking emissary of the ANC in France during the 1980s. Her notes tell us that before her assassination, she was investigating a matter of national importance involving the supply of arms to the apartheid government. And on the 29th of March, 1988, Dulcie was assassinated. Dulcie's killers have not been brought to justice to this date. We still don't know who killed Dulcie. There seems to be a kind of erasure of Dulcie's legacy and an appetite to allow her to become lost to memory. Joining us in today's conversation are Nicola Orenza, the youngest niece of Dulcie September, Enver Samuel, a producer at EMS Productions, who produced Murder in Paris, Kelly Eve Koopman, a writer as well as a senior fellow of the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity, almost, as well as Busisi Abe, a writer as well as an activist. We hope today we will have an honest and sincere and redeeming conversation about Dulcie September and what her story means for us today. But before we begin, we've prepared the trailer of Murder in Paris ahead of our discussion.
The African National Congress is the alternative force, and it's just a matter of time before the ANC becomes the government in South Africa.
That was a major shock to have someone shot like that, and in such a cowardly manner.
La France a été choquée, vraiment choquée.
Dulcie must have been on to something. To assassinate an ANC person in a foreign country is a very big decision for these guys. They could do it in Africa. They did it quite a lot.
Pourquoi on l'a tuée, elle?
Why? Why Dulcie at that time?
Que la vraie question, c'est pas qui, c'est la question pourquoi.
A cold case brought to life.
South Africa had made a deal with France for nuclear power. So from the 70s onwards, we were monitoring South Africa's nuclear weapon capability.
Our nuclear program is a huge secret, probably the biggest secret.
R5 trillion was spent between the mid-70s and the early 1990s. If Dulcie September had stumbled across the network of money and weapons and intelligence agents that were supporting the apartheid regime at the time, there's no doubt that she would have been an obstacle to some of those powerful players.
We found that a 17-kilogram bomb was placed on the door of our office, timed to blow us up on Monday morning at 9.
The apartheid regime had agents all over. You had to be looking over your shoulder all the time.
There was definitely decisions made about targets. People were actually on type of a target list.
30 years of searching for answers.
My subjectivity with regard to who I thought that the enemy was, namely the evil, racist, white minority regime in Pretoria, actually hampered my search for truth. I was chasing right-wing death squads and not looking at the left wing at all for years.
She's investigating something at a time when the entire apartheid edifice is falling apart. And I think that's a particularly dangerous moment to be asking questions.
She might have been onto something that wasn't wanted known then, and perhaps is still not wanted to be known.
Today, the search continues.
We need to question who profited the most from her murder.
Murder in Paris.
Thank you. Perhaps we can start with Nicola. Nicola, who is Dulcie to you?
Thank you, Noah. I think Dulcie has so many layers, and I think the most obvious to me is that she was my aunt. She was my mother's sister. She was family, and that is always first and foremost my experience of her as a family member. But different to what one would expect in terms of knowing a family member, spending time with family. We didn't have that opportunity to actually get to know her, spend time with her, do things that one would expect to be able to do with a family because of the fact that she was living in England, she was living in France, she couldn't come back. She had left this country on an exit visa. So our experience of her was quite different to the normal experience of family. And I think also the other aspect, is with regards to her as also, if family is overseas, one can chat, one can talk. What do you do? Where do you live? What are your hobbies? What are the things that you do? Even that was very limited in that respect. And much of that, of course, was with regards to what we know now, her way of protecting us as family members, her way of the less one knows, the better. Because when we were growing up, it was in a very different time. And knowing something could, one could end up in jail. One could end up not in favor of the authorities at the time. So there was this risk. So especially for my parents, they were always very concerned about that with the experience of my aunt, their protection for us also. But I'm also especially grateful for what she did. I think that is never going to change, for her lifelong work. The unwavering spirit she showed, but also the heroic sacrifice that she made, not only in the ultimate one of giving up a life, but the sacrifice of going to live somewhere else because you couldn't do what you were committed to doing, what was inside of you. You couldn't bring that out because of being stifled at that time. I think in many respects for her, we could have continued not knowing. At the time of her death and afterwards, it was okay, Auntie Dulcie had passed away, she had been murdered, this was hectic time, but what then? Ultimately, we didn't know the nitty-gritties of her life, of her work, of the reason then, of course, also as to why she was murdered. And I think, it was due to the hard work, the research, the time, and commitment also of people like Evelyn Groenink, through her book Incorruptible, through Enver, who's here on the panel with me, and people like Henny van Vieren and Open Secrets, through the work they chose to do, to look at, to research, to really dig, came across that there was so much that we didn't know. And then if one thinks of her being silent, then I think the question is also why the silence after her death also. Why this unknown? Why was it perpetuated? And so if it wasn't for the tireless search of key people, as I had mentioned, we wouldn't be here today. I, as a family member, my family would still not be any the wiser. So I think it is time for us to talk about her and to talk about her work, her life, what she did, her commitment. And I think we need to talk about it loudly, and we need to talk about it boldly, because her example, the person she was, the work she did, we need to know about it. I continue to be struck by the feedback received by people who watched part 1 and 2 of the documentary. And there's the expression of awe. People would say, wow. There's also that feeling of being cheated, of not knowing this part of history. So that thing of, so how did we not know this? Or how come, yes, I sort of remember Dulce September, but not all of this, and not all of this detail. How did we not know this? Why is this not much more prominent in the public domain? And then also the expression of respect. Wow, what a powerful and strong and committed person she was. What a strong woman. Just, geez, and then people's keenness to learn. So we want more. What next? Is there more coming? So I think we are in a time where it's a fertile ground to make known much more and much more broadly Dulce September. And much of it is also, I think, the fact that people admire, because she's quite a relatable person. In the fact that, she comes from a tough family background. My mother and my aunt didn't grow up in an easy, happy environment. It was tough. Their home circumstances, domestic life was difficult. She was a teacher. She trained as a teacher. My family, she wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. She didn't have famous family. She was a colored woman from the Cape Flats. She had a friend. She liked to laugh. She liked to speak her mind. But she was also moved by what was happening in the country at that time. And she knew that it was part of her responsibility to do something about that and to commit to something greater than herself. So her commitment to her community, her commitment to her family, her commitment to her country led her to make decisions that were tough. She experienced multiple losses of time with her nieces and nephews. She never had children of her own. A loss of time with her sister, family events, gatherings, all of that. But she was prepared to do that because she wanted something better, better for us as her nieces and her nephews, better for the country. And she wasn't going to be able to do that staying in South Africa at that time. So to me, to come back to your question, to me it is the honoring of someone I know, but also someone I'm getting to know more. Someone I've spoken about, my family's spoken about for a long time, but only spoken about on very superficial terms in a sense. And now the real conversations are starting. So for me, it's also, wow, I have a family member, I have an aunt who did this. So the question is also automatically that comes back is, so what am I doing? Also, and I think, this is also the ultimate question that she puts through her life and ultimately her murder, her death. This is what I did. What are you doing?
Wow.
Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Noah.
I think I know for myself personally, I can definitely relate to one, discovering the story of Dulcie and being enormously inspired. And I think for many of us at the NMF, actually, especially a lot of the young people, we hadn't heard about Dulcie. And in this project, working with EMS Productions, we've all been kind of introduced and exposed and kind of educated on her. And it's exactly as you describe it, this kind of shock, this kind of being upset that we weren't told. You know what I mean? Here is such an incredible, well of, you know what I mean, of inspiration, of fire, and just simply not told,
Yeah.
Kelly Eve, could I move to you? Who is Dulcie to you?
I like this question because I like the subjectivity of it, and it reminds me of the book by Pumla Kola, like What is Slavery to Me, which is another part of our history and my personal history that I have a similar, like, real interest in, become really moved by when you learn about the textures of it. And I think what's so important about Dulcie's story is that both as a person and in terms of a placement in the South African political history, it really challenges the kind of like narrow, rigid constructions of what we've placed our history or what we framed our history of, right? Like the first most obvious point is gender and the fact that, she's a colored woman and she's taking on racialized capital and capitalism and corruption and speaking out about gender discrimination in her own movement, like all at the same time. Like there's no like singular narrative around what her activism meant. For me, I mean, when I met her through a very little bit of work that I did on this podcast called They Killed Dulcie with Sound Africa, and also in collaboration with Open Secrets, and all the research they did in their book Apartheid, Guns and Money, which really unpacks this idea of sanction busting and the kind of the arms money machine. That's the term that they coined to describe the kind of the massive kind of political apparatus she was uncovering. That for me kind of really struck me, in that also I didn't really know about her, and in meeting her, there was just so much about her what you can gather about her personally that I'm sure Nicola has commented on, but also on the form of her activism, the boldness of it, the fact that even though she was told she was hysterical, not given security support, what is she looking into? She kept these, rigorous notes. She kept holding other members of the movement accountable, even though that in itself arguably was incredibly dangerous, because in this idea around who assassinated Dulcie, the uncomfortable idea of complicity, which I think the documentary also raises, and the kind of democratic transition in terms of what those kind of secrets did, is something we really have to face. And, like what I think is just really pertinent about the story is that the work she did is so incredibly relevant. Because if we look at one of the companies that she named or that she wrote about in her notes, which was Thompson, that she had, considered might be part of this, massive kind of inter-country apparatus around arms dealing, they changed their name to Talis, which is one of like, now concurrently, when we're looking at still looking at the arms court case that's being explored to the Zondo Commission, and which in 1999, like, that kind of really broke under the Zuma presidency, that is a company that's been involved with the state apparatus smuggling like billions of rand spent on weapons. misspent on weapons, but also on weapons that ended up killing the exact same, liberation cadres that were supposed to be protected during the time. So the infrastructure, the fractures, that the uncomfortable probing in terms of who she was and what the story provokes is at once incredibly inspiring and moving, because what a cool, radical woman, but also incredibly relevant in terms of when we consider how we remember, what we choose to remember, but also what that means in a very real sense. I mean, Craig Williamson is in this documentary, and I always found this so uncomfortable with our podcast as well, just kind of like speaking glibly about, oh yeah, sure, there was definitely a price on her head, she was definitely on somebody's hit list. Like in terms of when we're talking about like justice, restitution, memory, there's no real memorial to Dulcie. I mean, there's the Civic Centre in Athlone, which is, an important site, but also someone like Craig Williamson is like walking around here, like after having murdered a bunch of people, and so I think that the entire unfolding of the story provokes some of the most important questions that we talk about when we talk about who does our recollection of history include and not include, and what is and which threads, what are we uncomfortable with, and what is the very real consequence of that in terms of like the transition and the construction of the new South Africa and the new dispensation, and the uncomfortable things we have to face in terms of the ANC and what she also brings up about the movement. And I think I might be over talking, so I will wait for the next question.
No, thank you for that. I think there are quite a few lines there that I'd love to pick up with you later. But definitely as well, really relating this notion of, but how could they? You know what I mean? That big questioning. This is not as terrible and as heartbreaking as some of the aspects of the country that we live in is. Not like this, though, you know what I mean? Enver, can we move to you? Who is Dulcie to you? Before you actually, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to address our audience quickly. Hello. If you would love to, if you would like to ask a question on the platform, in the top right-hand corner of your screen, so somewhere like that direction, there's a little button that says "Ask a Question," and there's definitely space in the program where we will come and have your questions aired as well. So please do that. It makes it a lot more engaging for everybody involved as well. Enver, who is Dulcie to you?
And thank you to the Nelson Mandela Foundation for hosting this event. For me, I'd like to start off with a quote from Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela said, "I've learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." And for me, Dulcie exemplified this in more ways than one. And for my talk, and I think I'm going to use all 10 minutes of it, I've collated 4 extracts from the research gathered from Dulcie's archive that for me best demonstrate her character. And I'm going to read them out to you almost verbatim, because you have to, that's the way you're going to get the feel for it. The first one I would like to start off with is the last speech Dulcie wrote. It was prepared for a demonstration to save the Sharpeville 6 outside, and it was outside the South African embassy in Paris. Listen closely to the words of this determined, fearless freedom fighter, daughter, sister, and aunt. March the 17th, 1988, 11 days before Dulcie's assassination. Dear friends, you're gathered today here in front of the embassy of the white minority rule of apartheid to show your hatred of Hitler's heirs, who have sentenced to death 6 young patriots. I want to insist on this point. It is the first time that the regime will hang a woman because she was active in the struggle against apartheid. It is a way to frighten women because they are more and more active in our struggle for freedom and women's emancipation. We could threaten the racists as the 20,000 women did when they marched towards the Union buildings in Pretoria to protest against the pass laws in 1956. They sang, "You strike a woman, you strike a rock." Today, 60 of our patriots are waiting to be hanged Today, after 2 years of state of emergency, Pretoria is unable to stop the way forward of our people towards freedom, democracy, and the birth of a non-racial society. It is the murder for Dlamini, the collaborator, that the Sharpeville Six have been sentenced to the death penalty. They were arrested in their homes in November 84, presented to the court in September 25, 1985. In the meantime, they were in the hands of their torturers without any visits, not even of a lawyer, detained in complete isolation. On December 13th, Judge Human, who rejected all the evidence given by defendants, read the sentence: to be executed by hanging. Here's the justice of apartheid, this repugnant beast which devours the children of our people. Here's the justice of this repugnant beast, still alive because some governments refuse to cut links, refuse to stop collaborations, which you could stop by demanding to your government to apply mandatory sanctions. France, Great Britain, USA, Germany, Japan must stop supporting apartheid. The defeat of apartheid will mean the defeat of the racist forces all over the world. Together, we must save the Sharpeville Six. Together, we must save all our compatriots sentenced to the gallows. Together, we must demand the release of political prisoners of South Africa, the release of Nelson Mandela and his comrades of the Rivonia trial. Demand mandatory oil sanctions, isolate apartheid from all international forums, demand the end of diplomatic relationships and the closure of the racist regime's embassies all over the world. Populist sanctions now. Support our resistance and our armed struggle. Words are not enough now. Action is needed. And the fate of millions of people depend on what you will do or what you will not do. We call on you now, and with more strength than ever, to support our liberation struggle for a free, united, democratic, and non-racial South Africa. That is Dulcie September. Dulcie and patriarchy within the ANC. Dulcie worked 7 days a week. As Lindiwe Mabuza says in Murder in Paris, she was married to the people of South Africa, first and foremost. That's what every ANC cadre is about, the liberation of our people and our country. However, when issues of patriarchy within the ANC raised its ugly head, Dulcie was extremely vocal. Following a visit of Oliver Tambo to Paris in 1986, there were accusations of sexism against one of her comrades from a volunteer in the office. Dulcie wrote to the ANC. And when Dulcie wrote to the ANC, she wrote to Oliver Tambo, Thabo Mbeki, she wrote to the top. I can only ask that we seriously examine our atrocious methods of work and our attitude towards people. The question that is being posed, is the ANC not used to working with women as equals? Dulcie didn't brook any nonsense. Dulcie said it like it was. Dulcie and family. But there's a softer side to Dulcie. In a letter home to her sister Stephanie, she says, "Dear Stephanie, namaste. You know, of course, that I've become a yoga fanatic, and as I've indicated in previous communications, Steph, you may think that I'm mad, but it does help, especially when you live a hectic lifestyle and you don't know how to relax, how to switch off, as it were. I've bought myself a book entitled Yoga for the Over 40s. And what they're saying here, I'm already experiencing. I'm just thinking how tense you always are. I'm sure if you tried yoga, you'd soon feel a different person. Do try it. All my love, Dulcie." Dulcie, the wordsmith. Dulcie wrote poetry. Dulcie wrote a lot of poetry. As we celebrate Freedom Day tomorrow, I'd like to read an extract from a short story by Dulcie, written in the early 80s, called Fast Sounds on the Horizons, as I believe she was predicting April the 27th, 1994. And in the distance, we can hear the sounds of steadily running feet, steadfast feet, steady feet. And we know that these sounds that we hear are the sounds of those that are going to eradicate all this ugliness. These sounds that we hear are drawing nearer and nearer. They're getting very close, drawing closer and closer. And as the sun creeps over the horizon, adding long silhouettes to the sounds of steady running feet, I'll end with a quote from Advocate Thuli Madonsela. When secret of evil deeds are covered in darkness, they prosper. Dulcie September shone a light on these secret and evil deeds. Long may we cherish her bravery and her memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Enver. I think for me, what I relate most deeply about what you were sharing was this reality that Dulcie was human, that she was multidimensional, that she was layered, as Nicholas said, that she was personal, that she was a warm body, you know. So often on the other side of the spectrum of erasure is this notion of tokenism, where you become that one, you know, that one who was amazing, who was perfect, who was great. And I think that what's so powerful about the way that we are trying to remember her is through her humanity. That her story is not necessarily only one about her assassination, but it's about her life as well, and her living, her ongoingness, that she is a person for us today as well. Lucy, let me come to you. Who is Dulcie to you?
Hi, and thank you very much for having me. It is a great honor and a privilege actually to speak about a woman that I didn't know existed. And to a large extent, I feel a little bit of shame, but I'm also very excited because I am now at a space where I get to unapologetically delve into her history, her work, and also the person that she was through anecdotes, through the documentary that was set up, the book that was published, through Open Society, and as well through her family, right? And speaking specifically about Nicola as well. So for me, Dulcie represents erasure. And she represents erasure in the sense that in the wake of struggle narratives that solely glorify men, Black women, and particularly in this instance, colored women, have been exiled, forgotten, and erased. And in South Africa, like most countries that have experienced conflict, soldiers at war are often the only narrative that emerge and that is told. The face of the war has always been binary, has always been a binary one. So when we speak about Dulcie September, we realize that she didn't even get mere acknowledgement because she didn't conform or embody the traditional gender defined and stereotypical lifestyle of what a woman is supposed to be and do in society. She didn't stick to the script and couldn't even be reduced to an accessory to a man because she didn't have one. Right? So for me, when I learn about Dulcie and I learn about the fact that she's not remembered because she was a mother. She's not remembered because she was a wife to some big political figure that we memorialize today, but because of the fact that she tangibly did the work to effect the change that we see in our society today. And I think I love her because of the fact that she's not an accessory to a man. I mean, I love Mama Winnie. I am a Winnie Mandelarist all the way. But to a large extent, when you think about women such as Mama Winnie and your Charlottes, you attach them and you think of them as accessories to men. But that was not Dulcie. Dulcie was a very independent. She was a very straightforward, and from what I have been able to tell from the documentary and the literature that I've read about her, she was a very determined woman. Right? So I look at her as someone who made sacrifices. And in the aftermath of those sacrifices and suffering and the saving, there has been no truth-seeking, transparency, or justice for women like Dulcie or women of color, and especially for what Black and colored women have endured during the apartheid era. So when looking at Dulcie, we aren't even presented with an opportunity to ensure that we undo this representation of women as objects of history, right? So the retelling of her story for me gives us an opportunity to shame those who have insisted that African women have made little to no contribution to the continent's intellectual history and emancipatory struggle. So the dire need to record Dulcie September for me and her life is imperative as it will underpin the work of memory done individually and collectively by accounting one's history in order to make sense of oneself in the current moment. This is important for the colored communities in South Africa, more especially women, because through Dulcie's story, they get to underpin their own work, they get to account for their own people's history, right, and the contributions that they've made in the emancipation of South Africa and the African continent and the rest of the world. Right? So when you look at Simon de Beau's 1949 book, for an example, which is titled The Second Sex, you realize that representation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men, right? So they describe it from their own point of view, which they confuse with the absolute truth. So an imminent and something that is very important for us to take into cognizance is that the historical documentation of Dulcie reflects the interests and victories of its authors. So heterosexual white men consequently ignore women and female achievements, relevance, and grandeur as being often attributed to their male counterparts. So for me, this existing gender-related biasness in our history and the telling of our history discriminates against women and creates an ever-growing falsified record. Unsurprisingly, the history publicized resembles a simple and a monophotic roll call of accomplished men rather than looking at women. So when looking at Dulcie's story particularly, whenever women are not reduced to objectification, they are not considered at all. And consequently, this gender-based view within our struggle, within the history of our struggle, triggers an avalanche of pervasive issues. Notably, it generates a society built by and for men. So negative consequences from this approach range from causing women to experience discomfort to putting their lives in danger, which is something that Dulcie did. She was not uncomfortable about putting her life in danger. Essentially, when she was exiled and she went to Paris, she knew that there was a possibility, a very high possibility, that she would never see her family again. And that approach for me and that kind of conviction is something that should be upheld and something that should be taught to young women who are aspiring, who are growing not only in the political arena, but just in general society and in general life, right? So when you look at issues that are facing women today, like gender-based violence, like poverty, landlessness, and other issues, you look at the attitude from Dulcie September and you learn that, there are, to a large extent, some, even though there might be some discomfort in putting one's life in danger, there are some benefits. And this is something that I believe that Dulcie believed in, to the point where, she sacrificed her life, right? So I just don't want to go on too long, because I also want to just speak about the fact that the erasure of women is very dangerous. If we don't know that women are responsible or contributed to the things like struggle, scientific breakthroughs, or even defining pieces of art, for an example, how do we teach young women that they can strive to do the same? How does the colored community begin to engage with their lived experiences and challenges if we don't speak about women such as Dulcie September? So when we speak about, the unwillingness to engage with and actively rectify the plight of Black women and colored women, and how it has been set as a precedent for how women of color have been treated in South Africa, we have to then go back to something like the TRC, for an example. Right? And you look at the TRC and you see how in the aftermath of the sacrifices, the suffering, and the saving, there has been no truth-telling, transparency, or justice for women of color, and specifically for what our Black and colored women have endured, right? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission fell short not only in acknowledging the violence and the type of abuse that women, or Black women, specifically incorporating the colored community, endured because they were Black and colored, but it also failed to account for the violence that women faced at the hands of racist, brutal states that integrated and targeted women of color with tactics of violence stemming from patriarchal beliefs that women are somehow subhuman, that sexual violence against women is legitimate. So Dulcie September stands up against these ideals. And I think for me, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not do her any justice. I believe our former struggle leaders themselves did not do her justice. I mean, about 2 years after her assassination, Nelson Mandela was released, and the ANC was unbanned. But even after Nelson Mandela was released and the ANC unbanned, there was no acknowledgement of the role that Darcy played and the danger that she willingly stepped into in order to provide intel information to save not only her people, her community, but to also deal with, apartheid South Africa as we see it. So the unwillingness to engage in, the active struggle and the kind of emancipatory politics that Darcy was engaged in and spearheaded, for me, is erasure, right? And in just summing up, as we engage in, the festivities and dialogues of Freedom Month, we must remember the monumental sacrifices Darcy made towards the realization of freedom for all South Africans, and more especially the invaluable contributions she made towards the emancipation of colored people, and by extension, Black women, from the brutalities of a racist and patriarchal society. For me, her story and her struggle mirror that many women of color in South Africa today have picked up the baton for justice and continue to fight for freedom and equality. Her story is our story, and much like her, we refuse to be overlooked, silenced, and erased. I will leave it at that, but I hope as we continue on with the conversation, I can just unpack just a bit more of what I've been able to pick up from Darcy and what will inform my Black radical feminism, because I do believe that she was a feminist. She might not have said outrightly that I'm a feminist, but how she presented herself and how she engaged in the politics of the ANC, how she called out her leaders, how she asked a beautiful question that women today in political movements or in general society, be it in corporate, be it in social settings, are not proud enough, or they don't have, the vigor to ask. She asked, what is the role of women in this particular space? That is a very difficult question to ask patriarchs. I can assure you of that now, because one thing that patriarchs will tell you is they can tell you everything that they feel your contribution should be, but they can never tell you what it actually is and how it will inevitably help people around you. So I think for me, Darcy becomes, a new vision. She becomes a new light in our history, especially as Black women, and I'm including the colored community when I use Black, because I'm using the Biko definition of Black. And I believe her erasure is the erasure of all women in history. If we erase Darcy, we might as well erase Mama Winnie. We might as well erase Charlotte McLeod. We might as well erase even me, myself, as a Fees Must Fall student activist. We can't allow for the erasure of one woman and her story and her narrative to permeate within our society, because then we create a hierarchy and a class of acceptance. Right? We create a hierarchy where we say this kind of struggle and sacrifice in the struggle is enough, and Darcy September just doesn't make the cut. And that is very destructive. That is very divisive, especially amongst women. And we need to give this woman her flowers while she can still get them. And I'm really, really proud to have discovered who she is. And I hope that young people will start writing books, that they will start learning about Darcy September in institutions not only of higher learning, but in basic education as well. Let us stop saying Mama Winnie. Let's start saying Darcy September. Let's celebrate September as the month, as Darcy month, right? Where we speak about her work, where we share some of the discoveries that she made. Let's actively engage in the process of memorizing this woman and ensuring that she's not erased. Thank you.
No, absolutely. I think a colleague of mine, after we had that Instagram live about this dialogue, the pre-dialogue, so to speak, a colleague of mine said that he can only name maximum 5 struggle heroes who are women, and we know them. They're so well venerated, and I suppose that's the other part about patriarchy, and its ability to brand things as well, and its ability to brand the struggle as masculine, as men-centered, as brawn, and when we look at archival material, especially the kinds of archival material that's been shared and documented really well, it's of, it's masculinity and its performance and the rest of it. And one of the dangerous things is something that I picked up as you were talking, was how it makes us imagine what struggle is supposed to look like. So then Fees Must Fall, in Cape Town, when there's a gate that needs to be broken, when something needs to happen, men are pushed forward or bring themselves forward, or they push away other people. Because this is what the struggle looks like. You know, it's a black leather jacket. It's a, what's the word, a little Kangol cap, but the black one, you know what I mean? It's gonna look like the Black Panthers, you know? And even in that imagination, we recreate the same kind of exclusion, the same kind of patriarchal notions. This is what struggle looks like, you know? Nicola, if I could come back to you, when you were describing your relationship with Dulcie, it became really, well, it made me think about Sisonke Msimang's book, Always Another Country, and how when you have family outside of this country, it sounded very similar to exile. And I wanted to explore that a little bit more with you, this notion that this person is alive and a part of this family, and we have notions about who she is, but she's also not here. And we're aware that there are things that she knows that she is not telling us to protect us. And in that same moment, the kind of, you know, so in Always Another Country, Sisonke explores this performance of apartheid, you know, how, you know, every week or so, the policeman comes to check, you know, have you seen him? Is he around? You know, and it becomes that performance of, no, I don't know. Would you like some tea though? And on the face of it, they're supposed to be at odds. They're supposed to be enemies. They're supposed to be, but they know how this goes, you know, they're not going to pretend that this is new. And they have actual lives. And so the policeman comes over like, hey, oh, meneer, God knows what, meneer van Heerden. Come, no, I don't know where he is. Come sit down, let's have some tea. Sorry, I got distracted by that whole notion. Could you share a little bit more about that experience of having this member of the family who is away? And just a quick note that you're on mute. Ne?
There we go. I think there's this almost initially, and especially when one is younger. Look, I was 3 years old when she left. And so the memory of her, my memory of her didn't exist really. I think my brother Michael, who was 8 at that time, would have had more of his own memories of her. But for me, it was someone spoken about, not spoken to. I didn't speak to her, you know, we spoke about her. We read what she had written. And I remember I was always so impressed almost by her handwriting. You know, it's always the same, you know, there was very neat print and, you know, like steadfast, strong, you know, and it was just something significant I remembered about her. But the aspect of emotional attachment, for example, you know, that was missing because, you know, even if I look back at the time when I heard what had happened to her and, you know, her murder, yes, I was shocked. But it's difficult to cry and to feel for somebody that you haven't actually spoken to as such, that you haven't really had a conversation with. So my emotional experience of her was quite lacking. Yes, I was shocked and all of that because she's my aunt, she's family, she's my mother's sister. You know, the hurt that my mom experienced, that the family experienced, and that was difficult. And it's only now, I suppose, now that I'm older, I can appreciate it more. And so her reality and the sense I make of her needs to be different. It needs to be based on something else other than just my personal experience of her as a family member. So I connect with her through the stories other people tell. I connect with her through what people have written about her. through Enver's documentary. This is how I connect with her. So I've had to learn to be her niece in a different way. I've had to learn to connect with her, and I think it was important for me. Otherwise, I could remain detached. Otherwise, I could remain separate, and she is just somebody out there. You know, this has happened to her, and that. So yeah, so I think it was important for my own experience and for my own growth. And I suppose as one gets older, one at least for myself, became aware that I needed to do this and connect in that way to her, because part of that is then claiming back that she is my aunt. So part of her is claiming back that she's family, and she's my family. Although she was separated and exiled, and authorities and the regime at that time imposed certain things on her and led to this, you know, this is what we give you, you can't come back. There's there's the exit permit. It is not safe for you to return. It was important that, you know, my relationship with her was not going to be determined by what other people had imposed or wanted imposed and had imposed in terms of distance, in terms of having her not part of my daily life as a family member. So I think that process was important in reclaiming her as my aunt, as my mother's sister, you know, on that level. It's something I had to do. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I can definitely relate to that. So my grandmother passed away when my mother was very young, before my mother turned 15. And you know, you are given these stories about who this woman was and all of that. And recently my mom has been trying to reconnect with her maternal family. And vicariously through that process of which belongs to my mother, which she is undertaking,
Right.
it was like I'm a part of it in the sense that through these other, I'm going to say, versions of my grandmother, how she was someone's child, how she was someone's sister, how she was someone's, you know, niece. She becomes bigger in my mind, bigger than how she died. And it feels like in that process, I'm also claiming her as also mine, you know, not just belonging to the official story or the official narrative, but mine in a personal way as well.
Yes, very much so.
You're also a social worker as well. Would it be a big jump to say that maybe it runs in the family?
Yeah. I think there are both aspects. So yeah, I also have to acknowledge my father's family, who are also people who were active in their communities and of service. You know, so community broadly, through their professions, and yeah, it was part of family life, in the sense of when I say we grew up with that idea. So both my parents were very active in church and church activities. So as a young child, you go with to meetings, church meetings. You know, you also get, you know, part of doing certain activities in church. My father, many years ago, was also involved in some form of local politics. So you also go to meetings. If we look at my mom's family, they were teachers, you know, but my mom was also involved in other things. So from a young age, we were raised in that environment that your life is it's not only for yourself, that your life is there of service to others. And if we are going to improve anything in this country, we can point fingers, but we also have a role to play. So they weren't telling us, you must do this, you must do that, or, you know, and we're expecting this. It was more the example. It was more about the model. And this wasn't just for my parents, but my grandparents were also people like that, you know. So coming back to social worker, yes, I think so. Part of that is just professionalizing what has been happening in the family, over generations. Yeah.
That's really quite something. It's really quite profound. Enver, you've had your hand up for a while. I've been very rude to you. You've been very patient. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to tag on the when you brought up the question of exile. To reinforce that, when Dulcie September's interpreter in France was interviewed, I think he summed it up when he said, exile is like taking a child away from its mother. We tend to romanticize, that going to exile was a fun experience. But if you look at the correspondence, Dulcie's personal correspondence, you get an idea of the hardship of exile, the torture of exile. She talks about the weather, freezing weather, can't stand the weather, wrapped up in 2 jackets, no heat in the small apartment she has. So missing the flowers of Cape Town, missing the color, it's all gray in Paris. It's snowing. There's sleet. It was hard. It was really, really hard. People think that people were in exile on one big holiday, but far from the truth. It was a really, really difficult time and a difficult experience.
I hear you. Thank you. Perhaps while we still have you, could you talk to us more about the documentary in particular as well? I think that it's such a powerfully told narrative. I know for myself, it was told in a way that brought in so many different kinds of voices to bear on the same idea, the same notion, the same legacy. And I think that for me struck me quite with much force in the beginning, of my first impression, then kind of watching it slower. That sense of loss, that sense of not knowing, became an active thing that I felt from watching Murder in Paris. But also from the title as well, I think that there is something shocking about it. I think that there's also kind of other sayings and idioms around murder in Paris or something in Paris, and it's kind of, it holds this space and kind of people's imaginations as the height of, of the drama, it happened in Paris, there's that notion, and then there's the detail, and there's the particular kinds of textures that are involved in the documentary itself. I'm trying to manage multiple messages right now. Could you share with us the process as well of producing the documentary, of those kinds of interviews, and the kind of emotional grit and psychological grit that it takes to bear it all and to deliver it as well?
Yeah, thank you. Murder in Paris was a 4-year journey, a topsy-turvy journey of ups and downs, of the opening doors and another door and another door. It was a lot of research that the more you read, the more questions you actually had. And I think going to Paris in 2018 for the 30th anniversary of Dulcie's assassination was kind of the pivotal moment for the documentary, because we were able to get in contact with all her former colleagues and friends. And but the question that I asked myself when I was there was, why in Paris were they having a 1-week celebration of Dulcie's life, and in South Africa there was absolutely nothing. There was absolutely nothing. And I think for me, this made my journey even more, I've got to tell the story. Why is there this erasure? Why is it almost deliberate? Why is no one asking questions? So it's been a long journey, and I mean we managed to come out of the dark. There was a lot of dark experiences, but the documentary's been made. The documentary has done fairly well. It's been in the top 20 of the SABC viewing on S3. So I'd like to also maybe posit a different, is that for me, I'm feeling that the erasure of Dulcie September and the amnesia of Dulcie September is now becoming slowly but surely. If you look at the books, Evelyn Skronik's book on Dulcie Incorruptible, the podcast, Henny's book, the documentary, in October this year, they are actually going to be in Paris. The French judiciary is actually going to be looking into the case being reopened, and all this is happening. It's happening now. So for me, suddenly the silence, the erasure, it's slowly graduating from being off the radar to being on the radar. And I think forums like this, people, active citizens, can contribute to bring the name Dulcie September back into the public arena where it should be.
Absolutely. Just thank you as well for the work that you've been doing. I know there's multiple platforms that EMS Productions has been involved with in terms of raising the profile, highlighting the story, and so thank you for that. Kelly, even then, Busi, so I know you had your hand up. Please don't forget your point, Busi. Don't you go for it, Kelly?
Oh, sure. So I just kind of had a couple of thoughts in response to what Enver was just saying and what Busi was saying previously. And then, something that struck me about you speaking about this, localization of Paris is, how important the story is on like a global spectrum. Sarah Baartman died in Paris. Dulcie September died in Paris. We know very little about Sarah Baartman. There's no justice there. I mean, thank God Dulcie wrote, right? Because I think one of the ways that's kind of say in this project of memory, there's very loving work that people like Enver have done, people like Henny, all people have been involved in the story, is that there could be little distortion of what her experience was, what her emotional experience was, what her fears were, the ways that she wasn't protected by the women, but also just like her humanness, this idea of like flowers of the revolution versus like keep the home fires burning, that are the two binaries that, women activists get put in that Busi spoke to. Like it's impossible to place her into that because she kept a record and she wrote letters, and those were, thank God, kept through this kind of archival project that you mentioned that is so, explicitly important. And then two other things just, crossed my mind to this raising of Paris, and that what the erasure is so pertinent because what we lose and now what we gain through engaging with Dulcie's story is this similar thread of how colonialism, apartheid, the state capture and disenfranchisement we experience now. Like this is not like a project that just comes from like, oh, the NP government and like white people in South Africa hate Black and colored people inclusively. It's a discrimination project that makes a lot of money, and there is a price. A large price on Dulcie's life, and this it forces us to focus on a more global system of inequality that continues to profit off the exact kind of dispossession and disenfranchisement and corruption that she was speaking against. And it also forces us to challenge the global narrative around apartheid, around the role of accountability that countries like France have to play in terms of what they've done throughout the African continent. This idea around like who was on the right side, how do we reckon with our history? Like we can't make it smaller. There's a reason why apartheid still persists spatially and in terms of like, our lived experience. It's not only because the government hated Black people, of course they did, but like it's racialized capitalism. And and the documentary makes it so clear at almost every turn, is like, that's why it's uncomfortable, because as was mentioned with the TRC accountability, there's also a question of global accountability. I mean, we can all theorize as to who killed Dulcie. There was an assassin, sure, but that, that's a trigger on a gun. That's part of a much larger apparatus that includes shipping companies and banks and, institutions that hold up, kind of this social fabric. Like, there's a very real reason why this is a secret. And of course, it is because of the gendered erasure that we know, and because of the intersections that she fulfilled, and because of the ways that she kind of slipped through all these kind of paradigms of what we believe a liberation fighter to be. But it is also that she was the highest ranking ANC operative that was killed abroad. I mean, to be assassinated abroad is, firstly, like, it's a huge story. And secondly, like, she was incredibly important. That's also, possibly problematic, because I feel, when reading her work, I can read in against this kind of idea of martyrdom, or against like who is important in the movement. Like, there's a very strong, collectivist feel, but still, this is very real. And I did not very much work on the kind of investigative work of any kind on the podcast that I worked on, but similar to when engaging with Dulcie's story, so many other stories started coming up about women in exile, women who are part of the MK. There's a book that's just come out now called Voices of the Underground that profiles these stories. And then, films like Murder in Paris, movies like Kalushi, Barbara Boswell just wrote a book called I Wrote My Story Anyway. These are so important, in like, there's a resurgence of these stories for a very particular reason, because we're still facing those exact same challenges that she was kind of trying to fight against. And it's just one anecdote. I had the privilege of interviewing Shirley Gunn, who was an MK operative at the time, who wrote a chapter in a book called No Time for Mourning, which was about actually the death of Colleen Williams, who was a member of the Bonteheuwel arm of the MK, who also, there's been an Ashley Creel Memorial Project, which has been amazing, but she as well has remained a relatively unknown name. And what happened after Dulcie's death was that Shirley was a white woman, so she could go, undercover in ways that black women couldn't, but working with a collective, planted a bomb, like an explosive device, at night outside a French bank, like in a custard tin, because the French bank, it was an immediate response. It was a justice-driven response to mourning, to memorial, because that is also what memory is. It's in achieving that justice when we have a situation like the TRC, with someone like Craig Williamson goes free, and we don't know who killed Dulcie, but defying and placing, strategic action against a capitalist institution like a French bank, which then left the country, and going like, look at this. Like, this is what we have to be. This is what we have to be scared of. This is what we have to be cautious about. We have horrible figures like Verwoerd and Williamson and Puk Botha, who features in this documentary, but they aren't like, they're the dinosaurs. There's a whole lot more that Dulcie was.
I'm so sorry. Just clipped a little bit there. Last sentence, we didn't catch that.
I'm done. Cool.
Okay.
Oh, I can't remember. I think I was just going on.
Cool, no problem.
I was going on about capitalism and international complicity. Anyway.
What you're saying, what it really brings to mind is the fact that erasure is on purpose, and it is lived as well. In particular, it also reminds me of that show on Netflix, Black Earth Rising, with Michaela Cole, where Michaela plays a character who is embroiled in the discovery of French scandals in the Rwandan genocide and their involvement there. And how erasure is on purpose. It takes effort to hold a story down. It takes effort and intentionality to close the book, right? Erasure is in how, in particular instances, the National Archive gatekeeps the story of Dulcie, right? And those details and those facts. It's a thing that you do on purpose. And I think there is something that we need to dispel about erasure, and this fictitious notion that it's the absence of, it's not the absence of, it's the active, action of removing, of holding back because people's stories are like water in that sense, you know what I mean? They will flow, they will be told by word of mouth and otherwise. And it takes actual, so, you know, and the other point of inquiry, maybe we should come back to it, is who's benefiting from this erasure, right? Who and whose interests is the erasure in? And I think the documentary goes quite a long way in offering up various perspectives to answer that question, but maybe let's come back to that. Busi, you had your hand up as well. I didn't want to overlook you.
I feel like Kelly was drinking tea with me this morning. This is ridiculous. It's like we're sharing one mind. I absolutely love it. I mean, this is exactly what you get when you don't erase women in history. You have someone or people who are on two different planes of society in two different towns, cities, countries even, being able to resonate with one individual and that individual's accomplishments. I think for me, when Kelly speaks about how, to a large extent, Dulcie archived herself, and you see it in the letters that she writes, I think for me that is also very important in us as well, trying to ensure that, you know, there isn't any further erasure of Dulcie September. We should not also take or disregard how she chose to archive herself. I think it's also very important for us to respect the manner in which and the process that she had started in archiving herself, because we don't want to prescribe, how someone is written into history. But it seemed as if, and for me, it comes across as though Dulcie was very deliberate about everything that she did, from the letters that she wrote to her family, the things she said in those letters, to the kind of letters she would write to leadership and her own diary. She was a very deliberate person. She didn't do things haphazardly. So we should definitely respect her own personal archival process and see how we can amplify it and grow it from what I'm looking at. And I think for me, another reason why there's just like so much erasure, and this is just feeds back into the kind of climate and political atmosphere we live in South Africa and on the continent, is that politics or history prioritizes the accomplishments of men, right? So by prioritizing male accomplishments, female accomplishments become collateral damage. So this approach to recording history essentially must come to an end, which means that we need to stop denying acknowledgement of female achievements and how they lead to cultural and individual identity loss. Because by erasing Dulcie September, this is leading to a very big cultural identity and individual loss that I don't think we are taking into cognizance as a society, especially as people who are, very deeply entrenched within an archival process. And by diminishing, her legacy, society reduces women to mere ghosts, right? So in general, inadequate female representation in history derives from a patriarchal social construction that accredits the primary powers in our system to men, be it economic power, moral justification, political guidance, or even social privilege. So for me, fixing the past needs to start in the present. And that means resolving and preventing cultural amnesia. And in preventing cultural amnesia, we need to look at how it can be achieved with the help of prominent, spokeswomen and men. Other individuals within our society that we hold to a higher esteem need to start speaking about the erasure of women. And this is essential because women are essential characters in history, right? So to disregard this fact is to disregard a basic principle. Credit must be given where credit is due. And if women and young girls continue to believe false and incomplete narratives, then achieving a fair and inclusive society will only be a pipe dream rather than a tangible goal. So, without open dialogue, without progressive education, without major structural changes, future generations will continue to suffer from amnesia. And I think, us going through the work and the times of Dulcie September presents a challenge that I'm hoping that not only the country, but the continent is willing to take up and to run with. I mean, Kelly mentions the fact that Dulcie was assassinated in Paris. We lost Sarah Batman in Paris as well, and even her story is incomplete. There's so many women on the African continent, and I'm not just speaking about South Africa, on the African continent that have been lost, erased, and silenced. And I think when we continue to prioritize male accomplishments, we essentially render women to be collateral damage, but just a means to an end. And we're presented as means to an end in a society that is riddled with gender-based violence, that is riddled with, class inequality, social inequality, racial inequality, and we're not going to achieve the kind of society that Dulcie died for, right? Died protecting. I mean, we need to take into cognizance the fact that she essentially left her family, she left her friends, she left the only world, only society that she knew, that she was comfortable with. She went into a completely different space where she, had to adapt to the weather, language, people, the politics of that environment. And she was still able to fight and to struggle for the emancipation of our people, which cost her her life. And I think that kind of thing should be considered as a privilege in this country, especially from a historical perspective. So when it comes to the documentary, I personally absolutely love it. There are moments of utter sheer anger where I am throwing things at my TV because I cannot believe some of the atrocious things that people are saying, not only about her, but about the time in which, and the circumstances leading up to her death. I'm upset about the fact that the ANC government did nothing after, she had told them that she was not feeling safe, after they understood the nature of the investigations that she was busy with. The fact that she had absolutely no security annoys me, makes me very angry. But I love this anger. I like this kind of anger because it fuels a very revolutionary response. So when you see me picketing and protesting the next time, and I say I'm doing this in the name of Dulcie September, one would understand that I'm doing it understanding and having read and archived Dulcie September in the manner that she had already started. And I'm just doing, the legwork to finish it off. But yes, I think the documentary is very important, and hopefully it's something that can be watched in schools as well, where we can have honest, genuine conversations about women's role in the struggle, and also remove this racial division, right, amongst, struggle veterans, because in South Africa, in the current climate that we have, we only recognize what is known as predominantly Black struggle leaders, while the rest are erased because of the fact that they don't fit into this ideal picture of what emancipation should look like, which is very, very wrong. So it's going to be very interesting to see how young people engage with, the life and time of Dulcie, what they think of it. I'm excited to hear what, young girls in the Cape Flats are thinking, how they're feeling about Dulcie. I mean, she comes and she represents that kind of a community where most of the people in South Africa don't think anything good can come out of the Cape Flats. Every time there's a story about the Cape Flats or people in the Cape Flats, it's always a very destructive, very somber kind of story. But when you hear about Dulcie September and you identify her with the Cape Flats, it changes the whole narrative around communities, changes the whole perception that people have about a certain community of people, and hopefully it fosters an open engagement environment.
I think what you're talking to for me, and while just in this first impression perhaps, is this notion that when this country tries to resolve trauma through symbols, so you have this nightmare of apartheid, and then to resolve it, you put up statues, you put up faces, you put up, and there's there's been an ongoing critique about South Africa's, symbolism to resolve actual structural issues and matters. But then on the other side, at the same time, is that symbols matter. One of the most recent ones that have perhaps changed is the change at the University of Cape Town from it used to be called Smuts Hall. No, it wasn't called Smuts, it was called Jamison Hall. And now it's been changed to Sarah Baartman Hall. And it's weird having very tangential, very distant relationship with the story of Sarah Baartman. I felt a sense of pride. I felt a sense of redemption. And the other, it's also linked to the other thing that we spoke about actually on that Instagram Live, is that patriarchy is not just a notion, an idea somewhere in, you know, the academic or whatever, but it's lived and it's ongoing, you know. So it's so fascinating. You can live hypothetically on the corners of Mandela Drive and Nelson Mandela Avenue, you know what I mean, through Nelson Mandela Bridge, Solomon Mahlangu Street, Smith. It's in our mouths and the consistency of it, you know. Definitely. Thank you for that contribution. And for you have your hand up, but it's going to come to you in any case because I have two questions from the audience. So could you perhaps just note down what the point that you wanted to raise? And I'd love to read these verbatim because I've been multitasking and I haven't read it in its full, but I think I get the gist. So the first question is from Mickey. And it says, for Enver, which aspect of Dulcie drew you to her story? What stood out about this person that compelled you to make this film? And then the second question I feel is slightly related, and it's from Morgan Morris. It goes, as a filmmaker, I do have to ask, and I apologize, I've not yet seen the film, so I'm making assumptions based on what I think panel members have hinted. When you started the film, did you imagine that you'd be able to solve the mystery around who killed Dulcie September? And at what point did you accept that such answers were not forthcoming?
Okay, thank you. So I'll tackle the first one. I guess it's a kind of journey that I've been going through. I mean, and it started off with the documentary on Amatimo, and you know, I've come out from the normal television industry of just churning out stuff that at the end of the day doesn't really make an impression in terms of what is it done in the bigger scheme of things, you know, light entertainment, reality, magazine shows, whatever, you know, fine, it pays the bills, but it hasn't done anything for my heart, you know, it hasn't done anything for me, it hasn't made an attempt to make change, you know. So I guess when I did the documentary on Amatimo, the most embarrassing thing was that I didn't know who Amatimo was, and you know, I questioned why, you know, and it's, to a certain extent, it's the same with Dulcie. You know, I kind of vaguely had a recollection of an ANC operative assassinated in Paris, but I didn't know the story. I didn't know, you know, the layers and layers of you know, the story that was there. It was a story waiting to be told. You know, the minute you started to research Dulcie's story, you knew that this was an important story to tell. And then, of course, I mean, the chance meeting with Dulcie's family in Switzerland when I was there for a documentary festival. So it was all like you know, synergy, you know, whatever the word is, but I just knew that this is a story that needed to be told, and it's been the driving thing that kept me going for the past 4 years. The story has to be told. Then the second question, I from the beginning, I don't think so. It was the intention to solve the mystery, and I decided to twin this documentary with Evelyn Groening's quest to find the killers of Dulcie September. So Evelyn is a Dutch journalist that wrote the book Incorruptible, and I thought that let's tell the story through her eyes. Let's have a vehicle to tell the story. So it's not just a history lesson about who Dulcie September was. We look through Evelyn's eyes at her theories of who she thinks killed Dulcie September. So it wasn't like the be-all and end-all that we should find Dulcie September's killer. I mean, the person that killed Dulcie September was a trigger man. He was hired to do it. there's a bigger question about who ordered the killing. So, that was the premise of the documentary. It was never to really find out who actually pulled the trigger.
Thank you, Enver. And I think you also had your own points that you wanted to raise as well.
Oh yes, it was just on the schools. So we have a very active social impact campaign rollout in conjunction with the Nelson Mandela Foundation to take this documentary to schools, together with an educational guide that we've come up with. So this is part of the plan. We've been actively involved with the Nelson Mandela Foundation. We are doing a rollout in 10 schools in Cape Town and 10 schools in Johannesburg. And, we can't wait to see what the response of the kids are to the documentary, a shorter version of it. But it was always important for us to have a plan for after the documentary was shown on television.
Thank you. I know we're also working in some ways together on the legal action as well. I believe recently the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and I'm hoping if Vern is watching, could you drop me a text? Because I don't want to mess this up. But I stand to be corrected. But we've written, the Nelson Mandela Foundation has written a letter to the French embassy, I believe. That's the detail I'm not entirely sure of, but really advocating and hoping for the investigation to be reopened, even at this time, so that we can try and come closer. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of work that's been happening and that has taken place and will take place going forward as well. And I believe that also answers a question from Julie, I'm going to say Chancel, around the legal action. So perhaps, Enver, do you want to maybe answer some of that from the legal perspective as well?
So the LRC, the Legal Resources Center, acting on behalf of Dalsie's family in South Africa, have, together with a French lawyer looking at the case, have presented the papers and documentation to the court. And the court has taken this into consideration, and in October, I think it's the 14th, but in October, they actually will give a response to the papers that have been filed. So it's optimistic that there will be a reopening into the case of Dalsie September, but we can't preempt the court. But this is it's an important move. It's really incredible opportunity to begin a second stage of trying to precisely find out who's behind the killing of Dalsie September.
I hear you. Thank you. I think I'm going to open it up for one more round of reflections to all of our colleagues. I think that this is an ongoing conversation. I think that the conversation is going to continue around social media, in living rooms, in memories, and in later conversations as well. So perhaps let me take one more question from the audience, and then I think, shall we go once more around the room? Perhaps there's a better way of saying this, but what I have is kind of closing remarks as we begin to draw closer to a close. Busi, can I start with you?
And it's always a pleasure. I'm always ready. So for me, wow. I mean, there's just like so much. I think in our Instagram pre-dialogue conversation, I mentioned that when I went through, the archives that I have at my disposal, and I watched a bit of the documentary, and I also listened to the podcast and Open, Society, I was gobsmacked because of the fact that it seemed like a movie. It seemed like something that came straight out of a fairy tale. Like, she seems like someone who wasn't real. And it goes back to this narrative of, women being magic. And I don't necessarily like using that connotation because magic is not real. And Dulcie September was real. So I don't want to say she was magic because she was real and magic is not. We must be realistic at some point. I mean, we can always idealize all we want and, use grammar and English, to theorize and put people in the periphery. But we need to ground her and we need to respect the work that she did. We need to respect the archival process that she had started through the letters that she wrote and the reflections that she wrote and her diary as well. And we also need to reclaim her, right? I think one of the things that made me very upset when I listened to the podcast on Open Society was hearing about the response that people in France had when she was assassinated. The fact that they shut down their streets and they protested, calling for justice for Dulcie. And for me, the fact that there wasn't some, that sort of response from South Africa paints the picture of the problematic nature, not only of our politics, but the role that women play in politics and emancipatory, struggles. And I think for me, Dulcie presents us with an opportunity to rewrite our history and to do it the right way this time around, to tell the truth and be unapologetic about the truth. And also she presents us with a very interesting investigation, not necessarily around who killed her, because I mean, if we're going to focus on the nitty-gritties as to who pulled the trigger, then we won't get, the satisfactory response as to why. I'm very, very interested in why. And particularly from the narrative of who, I just want to understand who was involved, right? But when we speak about why, I want to understand whether what she was assassinated over is something that is still permeating in our society today. It's still a social ill that we're faced with today. It's still something we have not resolved till today. It's something that our leaders have missed 25 to 27 years after democracy. So she presents us with interesting questions to challenge, to re-examine, to reevaluate our history, our emancipation process, and the movement for liberation in South Africa. She also presents us with a very interesting lens with which to look at our leaders. I mean, some of the letters that she was writing to the leadership were letters to your Oliver Tambos. She was writing to your Nelson Mandelas. These are leaders that we revere in our society. These are leaders that we celebrate. These are leaders that, we consider to be the creme de la creme. For lack of a better word, of our political society. And when we find out that you challenged them and took them to task on sexist issues, on safety politics, on the women's role in the revolution, and you hear what their responses are, as women, we get to understand what the line of demarcation is and how we should move forward politically and how we should engage in politics. To a large extent, women are not only relegated to the periphery, but to a large extent, we are erased. So for me, she remedies, the gender imbalance in society, and her story attempts to, give credence to, remarkable female figures. She presents opportunities and motivation to start supporting more women-led projects and to listen to women and their analysis of a particular situation. I believe had she been listened to, I believe had she, been taken as seriously as she should have, to a large extent, we wouldn't be sitting here wondering who assassinated her, but we would be engaging on, other substantial matters, which was what she found out in her investigation. We would be engaging those kinds of politics as opposed to who assassinated her. So I think it's time that we start taking women very seriously, especially when they report feeling endangered, feeling like they are not safe or secure, not only in their working environment, but also in the political arena that we find ourselves in. I'm excited that this documentary is going to schools. I can't wait. My niece is definitely going to watch it 600 times before she goes to school and watches it at school, because I want her to be there and be like, no, guys, you're not doing it right. This is not Dulcie. Because you must have, those little ones within the masses, to steer the conversation in the right way. So I think it's going to be very important. I wish, everyone who is taking the legal battle up on behalf of Dulcie all the best of luck. And as a social justice activist in South Africa, whatever I can do to garner support on our side in South Africa to say that we want this case to be reopened. And with the new technology that is available to us in the world today, we surely should be able to come to an amicable and reasonable resolution to this case. As social justice activists from various circles that I represent, I can assure you that women in South Africa were ready to stand up for Dulcie. We're ready to make sure that the archival process and the remembrance of Dulcie September does not just end in the periphery or in a Nelson Mandela discussion. No offense. I mean, I love you guys. But we need to take it, I love you guys. We need to take it to the streets. We need to take it to the people. It's time that South Africans reclaim Dulcie. Dulcie is ours. She's our person. She is a daughter of the soil. She is a mother to many of us, even though she didn't give birth to us physically, but she's an embodiment of what I aspire to be as a Black radical feminist activist. I want to get to a point where I believe in something so much and so frivolously that I die for it. So yes, thank you.
No, thank you. I'm seeing Dr. Bev Orton in the chat. Please post more details about where people can get your book in the chat there, and then we'll share it with our audience as well. Kelly, there's a question here that I'd love to direct to you. It's from Nozibele Makanda, and it goes, how can we make sure that all our liberation heroes and heroines are accorded the same status and due accolades? I think perhaps to extend this question, what does remembering do? And how can we remember in a way that is constructive and that is productive? And I know this is a dense and loaded question, but perhaps just as a first take, as a first impression of it.
That's a very difficult question. I would tap into with a lot of other, maybe I'll also do my closing remarks because I don't have many, but I actually just really want to express thanks to the people, like Enver, Nicola sharing family memory, these are different, Busi sharing activist experiences in the context of Dulcie. These are different ways that we remember through our embodied experiences, and like with the documentary, like with Evelyn Grunick's work that she was, speaking about how arduous it has been with Open Secrets. I know the kind of work they've been done with South Africa and Erasmus, who I worked with shortly. It is very loving and very difficult work. And at times it puts you at risk, and it's very vulnerable work. And I suppose there are many ways to answer that question politically. I mean, what is living heritage, right? What is reclamation of our spaces and our stories look like now? Because in the trajectory of Sarah Baartman, Dulcie September, this is collective memory, this is generational memory. Many of our mothers and grandmothers have not the same experiences, but very similar when we speak about exile and displacement. There are many ways to feel exiled and emotionally displaced and structurally displaced from a social fabric. And I think monuments, statues, all of that is important, sure, but I think what's important is living heritage and the fact that these stories continue, and that in the same way that Dulcie wrote her experiences and spoke out when she was gaslit, when she was ignored, our narratives, no matter how small we might think they are important. And the fact that we live in a South Africa where we face the kind of inequality and corruption that someone like Dulcie was fighting against, that is living heritage. And I suppose it's about on more than a kind of broader political spectrum, about taking that on in the ways that we feel is necessary, even if that means speaking to our grandmothers. There are people who are alive, like Betty van der Hayden, who was in the documentary, who also, when we launched the podcast, had the privilege of speaking to, and she's alive. She would be looked over as an old woman had she been walking down the street. It's just this wealth of living memory and experience, who also went to prison, as so many others did, who was also part of various political groups. Like these are not grandiose stories only. These are like living. And I just really want to thank the people who take on the memory project in the various ways, that through posterity of film and media, but also just through activism, but also just through like talking to our mothers, like it happens in so many different ways. We remember in so many different ways. We remember through justice too, we remember through it all.
Just before you leave, the podcast, could you tell us a bit more about the podcast? Who was involved?
Yeah. So, yes, I think it was released, I think 2020. I get so confused as to what year it is and when time happened, but it was released with Sound Africa, which is a really great South African podcasting NGO actually, and they're still running and doing lots of projects. And it was a collaboration with Open Secrets, who, as had come up a lot in the conversation, had done a lot of kind of archival work around this and wrote the book Apartheid, Guns and Money, which also has a chapter about Dulcie. But the work that they do is kind of around these very questions. And I guess, also just holding thumbs, as Lucy mentioned, for the case. It will be a big triumph in as much as this film on a public broadcaster that we also know is steeped in a lot of strange things that we don't necessarily like, has broadcast this in a public space where actual, people can touch it. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think this panel discussion wouldn't be a panel discussion without panelists. And so I think but also for the work that you've done, I think that the article that you wrote with Africa as a Country has been a wonderful resource, even for me as well, kind of starting to uncover. So those archives that are produced by ourselves as well are also relevant and powerful. Not only the documentary, but the article that you've also contributed.
Yeah, I just want to name so that it was, I have to name that it was also Rasmus Spitz. I didn't name his name, who wrote that article and also produced the podcast and did a lot of work around it. So I just want to make sure I include the names of people who have, as far as possible, who have worked on it in my experience. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Neil.
No problem. And for this, so I'm gonna give an opportunity to close now. But there's also this question that I think has been posted here by Chantal Willie Peterson. It goes, I am investigating the sonic presence of female protests in South African music in the clandestine era of the 1980s. I'm looking at Satima Benjamin and Dulcie September's lyrical text and poetries. What are your thoughts on the entanglements of these narratives, lyrical text in protest music, and how a revisit to these texts can impact and empower young women in South Africa today? And perhaps maybe riding on top of this question, what were some of the, were there any writings of Dulcie in the documentary that was more direct? How can we access them, or are they difficult to reach? And perhaps more reflections on this question as well.
Well, actually, that's an interesting question. I mean, I actually met Satima B. Benjamin in New York. What an amazing woman, what an amazing musician. So I can engage with the person with the question personally if he wants, but the premise of his argument, I think, is quite interesting. But yeah, I mean, we can go on with that for quite a while. With regards to Dulcie's archive, I spent about 4 days at the University of Fort Hare, and they are the custodians of Dulcie's archive from the French Paris mission of the ANC desk. So this treasure trove of archive is currently held at the archive at Fort Hare. There's questions about where's the rest of certain things. Certain things are missing. When Dulcie was assassinated, apparently the French Secret Service took away certain things, documentation. So I wouldn't qualify it as being the full complement of her archive, but there is a lot at University of Fort Hare. There is archive at the Maibue archive, but predominantly the biggest part of the archive is at the University of Fort Hare. And I'd just like to, in my closing, say that I've got a very strong impact team working with me. And if you could please follow us. I mean, the work we're doing is on all social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, murderinparis.com. We have just come up with a website. So if you follow us and be part of seeking justice for Dulcies, particularly when we lead up to October. And in closing, I would say that Evan Kroenig, in a speech at the annual Dulcie September lecture, said Dulcie September was a school teacher, and if you didn't do your homework, you'd get into trouble. And I think if Dulcie was alive and she'd see all the trouble that we're going through today, she'd be in the forefront of making a voice heard and asking why are people not doing their homework.
Thank you. I think it's got a poignant way to close off as well. If you get the moment, if you could just drop me a text with the website name, because I've been on the newsletter subscription, and it's been enormously helpful, and I really want to share that service with other people as well. So perhaps could you share that website and we can post it to the platform. Nicola, I just want to open this as an opportunity for closings from you as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah. I think, first of all, I'd like to say on behalf of the family, thank you to the Nelson Mandela Foundation, thank you to EMS Productions for this opportunity, for engaging around Dulcie and her memory and her legacy, and the various layers around her life and her death. Because this is how we keep her memory alive, by creating opportunities for engagement, for dialogue, for talking. So thank you very much for that. And again, thank you to people like Enver, who've made it, and Evelyn, who've made it almost a personal journey too, in their work, in engaging with what they have found. So I think from our side also just to thank them for the sacrifices they have made. And I think what is important, and in being themselves, have created all the work and as it developed this public face of my aunt, and has made it known on much wider circles than we as family could ever have imagined, made it known about who she was, what she did, what her legacy is, and and still trying to find answers to very important questions. So there is a great thanks to them also, and to the people who have been part in this journey. And I think, on the eve of commemorating, our country's first democratic elections, or that took place in 1994, I'm also reminded that, over all these years, things haven't maybe worked out the way we had hoped. That we had very positive expectations, and there was this hope for something better. And in many ways, it didn't occur, but it doesn't mean that nothing good came of it. I think what is important here is that being ourselves and living our lives according to what we believe is right, and working for what we believe needs to happen, that is already very powerful. You know, being able to talk about what we are talking about today with our families, with our friends, is so powerful already. And I wanted to come back also to what Kelly Eve also spoke about with regards to, you know, talking to the older generations in the family is key, is important, because there is such a lot of memory there of the past that if we don't create the opportunity for that, that disappears. So it's not only necessarily about the community memory, but it's also about the family memory. And I think if we don't have that space to listen and engage with key people in our families, in our streets, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, a lot of that memory will just disappear. So we have responsibility for that too, because there's so much untold stories of the past that we are losing because we're not creating the opportunities to talk about that. I'm very hopeful. I'm hopeful with regards to what will happen in the future with regards to my aunt, her work, people getting to know her. I'm very hopeful with regards to the impact it will have. And I think in many ways, we as the family never expected it to go in the direction it has. So in that sense, we are looking forward to it and think, wow, this is opening so many doors. So many people have responded so positively. It has created opportunities for so many people to get to know part of the history and the local history. We need to continue this. So I think I'm hopeful. I'm excited about that. I am again, grateful for the opportunity for these kinds of forums. And I'm also grateful for the opportunities that Enver and his team are creating to engage with various sectors in communities about her. And we as the family, support that as much as possible and will be there as far as we can be in terms of also making that real. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I don't think that there's no doubt about that. And there's much more to engage in. And ultimately also just looking at personal and family. There's also the questions around the court case. There's the questions around why her finding out still what is going to happen. But I think there's been this very positive change towards, rediscovery. This is what is happening. So yeah, I'm energized by that. And I really look forward to how this will snowball and what will happen in the future. Yeah, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us as well. I think there was this really powerful moment when you said, Dulcie, my aunt, and that for me was really quite a profound moment. So thank you for joining us as well and giving us your time, your presence. So yeah, thank you everybody at home or at work or wherever else you may be for joining us today. The living archive of Dulcie's story is a part of the fabric of this nation, whether we acknowledge it or not. And by having conversations about her, we contest her erasure and we insist that Dulcie lived. Follow us on Twitter. We had a whole conversation about pronouncing Dulcie, and Dulcie, which I think I'm thinking about the brand, the clothing brand that's really up in my mind, and I gotta get it out there. Follow us on Twitter at Nelson Mandela to continue with this conversation. Subscribe to our newsletter via our website at nelsonmandela.org, which is also where you can donate to the work of the foundation and support the unfinished work of Nelson Mandela. To follow and subscribe Enver and his team at Murder in Paris, please visit murderinparis.com, which is also where you can subscribe to the newsletter, or follow them on Twitter as well at Murder in Paris. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion and that you'll have a good evening further. Thank you for joining us, and cheers, folks.
The African National Congress is the alternative force, and it's just a matter of time before the ANC becomes the government in South Africa.
That was a major shock to have someone shot like that, and in such a cowardly manner.
La France a été choquée, vraiment choquée.
Dulcie must have been on to something. To assassinate an ANC person in a foreign country is a very big decision for these guys. They could do it in Africa, and they did it quite a lot.
Pourquoi on l'a tuée, elle?
Why?
Why Dulcie at that time?
Parce que la vraie question, c'est pas qui, c'est la question pourquoi.
A cold case brought to life.
South Africa had made a deal with France for nuclear power. So from the 70s onwards, we were monitoring South Africa's nuclear weapon capability.
Our nuclear program is a huge secret, probably the biggest secret.
R5 trillion was spent between the mid-70s and the early 1990s. If Dulcie September had stumbled across the network of money and weapons and intelligence agents that were supporting the apartheid regime at the time, there's no doubt that she would have been an obstacle to some of those powerful players.
We found that a 17-kilogram bomb was placed on the door of our office, timed to blow us up on Monday morning at 9.
The apartheid regime had agents all over. You had to be looking over your shoulder all the time.
There was definitely decisions made about targets. People were actually on the type of a target list.
30 years of searching for answers.
My subjectivity with regard to who I thought that the enemy was, namely the evil racist white minority regime in Pretoria, actually hampered my search for truth. I was chasing right-wing dead squads and not looking at the left wing at all for years.
She's investigating something at a time when the entire apartheid edifice is falling apart. And I think that's a particularly dangerous moment to be asking questions.
She might have been onto something that wasn't wanted known then, and perhaps is still not wanted to be known.
Today, the search continues.
We need to question who profited the most from her murder.
Murder in Paris